Hi. Well, we we're at an interesting period in between the testaments, and as we discussed in our last class, we've now ended up with the Palestinian area, particularly, but all the Jewish people really having these two political sects who are vying for the leadership of the nation. Um, and they're called the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And so, in this all out effort to protect the national identity by following the law very closely, this hyper conservative group called the Pharisees begins to emerge, um, presenting the nation with laws and guidelines that fence in, that protect, that allow the people, or they believe allow the people to not have any danger of breaking the laws. They become so conservative that they fence in and protect policy and tradition rather than understanding the adherence to the law based off of the heart and the concern for God. The Pharisees began to incorporate these laws as the Hellenists grew even within Jerusalem. And so they're beginning to have this opposite sort of group of people growing during this time who were also quite prestigious. And so during this time, the Pharisees' rival sect, the Sadducees, were perpetuated by the ideas of the Hellenist. They were the educated, they were the sophisticated. They took on some of the theology, some of the mindset that was surrounding them in the Hellenist cities. And so the Sadducees really were these wealthy, powerful Jewish aristocrats that openly worked with the Gentile rulers to maintain peace, ensure a measure of political clout. They would be the ones that were more understanding or tolerant of the Gentiles who were beginning to be the rulers, obviously, within Palestine. John Hyrcanus, had been raised really as a devout Hasidim, and his life really reflected a scribe of the law. But his children, because of his influence within the nation, really were aristocrats. And so the children of Hyrcanus were trained more in Greek than in Hebrew thought, and they looked upon the Pharisees really with disdain. They thought of them as being less enlightened, less sophisticated, less educated, less noble. And they thought of them as being stuck in their traditions, that they were the ones that didn't understand how the world was changing, all of those things that we're very familiar with. There's nothing new under the sun. And so that's kind of who the Sadducees were. And the Pharisees and Sadducees had to deal with one another because they were no longer really in charge of the politics of their nation, not truly. The eldest son of John Hyrcanus was Aristobulus, or Judah, and he wins this struggle to inherit the throne. Aristobulus was a tyrant. He was known to be mean. There's things written about him of how awful he was, even to his own family. He cast 3 of his brothers into prison. 2 starved to death while they were in captivity. The other lived and will later become the sole heir. But another brother was killed in the palace. Aristobulus continues to expand the territories of Judea. He takes the title of king. So he begins to think of himself as king. He takes this title on as king. He dies young, only after a year of being king, of drink, disease, and anxiety. He was a horrible young man who was ambitious for all the wrong reasons and cruel beyond any imagination. Aristobulus had one brother who was still living in prison when he died. It was Alexander Hyrcanus, and Alexander Hyrcanus then became the ruler. His Hebrew name was Jonathan. His Greek name was Alexander. He was called Alexander Hyrcanus. And under his rule, the Jewish state became the largest that it had been since the time of David and Solomon. And it was almost it was almost actually as large as during those days of the great kings, the true kings that God had appointed in Israel. Most of these territories quickly Judaized. The Edomites, they came to exercise an important place in the Jewish national life. Galilee became one of the principal centers of Judaism, where Jesus would begin his ministry. And it's during the days of Hyrcanus that these things happen. Samaria still remained resistant and maintained its independent non-Jewish character. So even though Hyrcanus took Samaria, Samaria really rejected the Judaizing or the Jewish law, the precepts that even Edom at this time really accepted. And we're going to see, of course, Edom become a major player, and then finally the Herods coming from there. And this is the days when Edom really kind of becomes a part of this incorporated state of Judah. The rift between the Pharisees and the Hasmonean rulers, which began during the days of John Hyrcanus, really reached a climax during these years. Alexander Hyrcanus kept the Pharisees in subjection. He used foreign mercenaries. And Alexander Hyrcanus really was the reason for an event that happened that really would put the Pharisees and Sadducees at odds for many years to come, and really made the Pharisees hate the Sadducees. All of this really is interesting when we see them unite in order to kill the Messiah. That it is a united front of two parties which have not been in political play with one another in many years. And to see the way that they treat Jesus together, united, incorporated in one mission to kill the Messiah is very interesting, because during the Feast of Tabernacles, during Johannes's reign, he pours that water of liberation. We're going to talk about the Feast of Tabernacles when we look at the harmony of the Gospels. But there has become part of the Feast of Tabernacles this ceremony called the water liberation. And he takes the water and he pours it, instead of the way that it's prescribed by the Pharisees, he pours it at the feet of the altar instead of where the Pharisees had prescribed. The people at the feast, especially the Pharisees, were enraged. They openly break out into the civil war, and the Pharisees are enraged, and they go and they ask and invite the king of Syria to aid them against the Sadducees and against the king Hyrcanus. And now the descendants of the Hasidim Jews ask the descendants of, believe it or not, Antiochus Epiphanes to aid them against the descendants of the Maccabees. So crazy history. If we ever think for 1 minute that we are somehow in some type of year of history where political play is somehow unusual or unheard of, we certainly are not. Even the Jews were subject to that over and over and over again during these 400 years. Well, this civil war breaks out. The Syrians come, and Hyrcanus is forced to hide in the hills of Judea, and the Pharisees then fear the Syrians more than they did Hyrcanus. And they go to him and they run to him and they ask him, will you come back and will you help us kill the Syrians off? And so Hyrcanus hunts for the leader, the leader of the rebellion. He gives this banquet for the Sadducean leaders to celebrate his victory. And at this banquet, he crucifies 800 Pharisees in the presence of his guests. So though he's asked to come back, he then destroys and kills 800 Pharisees at the celebration feast after he runs off the Syrians. It's a mess. And so really at a climax during these years, just 70 years before Jesus comes, the Sadducees and Pharisees are really put at odds against each other. Tradition says that Alexander Hyrcanus repented on his deathbed when he died in 76 BC. And he asked his wife, Salome Alexandra, to dismiss the Sadducean advisors and to ask for aid from the Pharisees. It is just it is just an incredibly interesting time in the history of the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Salome Alexandra, she was successfully married to both Aristobulus and Alexander Johannes. So she was the widow of two Hasmonean rulers, and she succeeds them to the throne as queen. She's the only woman to ever rule Judah except Athaliah, of course. And we remember that Joash was this baby who was hidden in the temple until he could become king. And during those days, Athaliah, who has killed all of her other grandsons, rules Judah, or rules during those days. And of course, she rules only to a terrible death. She didn't rightfully rule, but she did. And so Salome Alexandra is the only other queen, but she cannot officiate as high priest. She's not able to do that. And so the son of John Hyrcanus assumes this priesthood. Her son, Hyrcanus, the grandson of John Hyrcanus, takes this priesthood. Her other son, Aristobulus, is made the military commander. So Alexandra and the two grandsons of John Hyrcanus two great grandsons, of John Hyrcanus will rule. Alexander's brother, Simeon B. Shita, who was a Pharisee, he was leader of the Pharisees, he will play an important role during this time, and she will try to straddle this. So she's got this brother who's the leader of the Pharisees. She's got the two grandsons of John Hyrcanus who are the high priest and the military leader. And she's going to try to bridge this gap between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because after all, they're all in the family for her. So under Alexandra, the Pharisees did have an opportunity to have some contributions. They made some really great contributions. Actually, the most real and influential thing that they do is they will institute the education within the nation. They are under the presidency of Simeon B. Shita. They will institute and claim the right for every young man that they should all be educated, even in Nazareth, which would be what Jesus would have fallen under, and under the Jewish Council of State, the Sanhedrin, and the president of the Pharisees will lead this charge. Education was primarily in the Hebrew scripture, but it also was a comprehensive system of education, and it was mandated for these Hebrew children. And so in the larger towns and villages and cities throughout the Jewish state, literacy, education, wisdom became very encouraged. And through Alexander's reign, there was quite a bit of peace, actually. And there was some peaceful compromise during these years. The country was still divided greatly, and there was this very deep, still embedded hatred between these political parties. There was peace. And remember, most of the people during these days were the multitudes who were still striving to make their pilgrimages to the temple, to still live somewhat peacefully under the Jewish law, maintaining the laws of God, remaining pure, remaining holy. The Pharisees were happy with this newfounded recognition. The Sadducees were resentful of that fact, but they had kind of lost their momentum. The Pharisees sought revenge for the massacre of their leaders at the banquet of Alexander Johannes. They will not forget that. They remember that. The Pharisees losing 800 of their leaders would not shortly forget that. The Sadducees were killed in an effort to right the wrongs throughout this time. And it really began to ramp up towards the end of Salome's days, and it really becomes somewhat of an all-out civil war. So Alexandra's two sons begin to take sides. Alexandra dies in 67 BC. So remember, we're just 67 years before Jesus comes. Her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, who was serving as the high priest, takes the throne with the support of the Pharisees. Her youngest son, Aristobulus, who remember is the military leader and military in chief, he leads the army of the Sadducees into Jerusalem to take the throne. So these two sons of Salome, Alexandra, have taken sides, one the side of the Pharisees, the other side of the Sadducees. The Pharisees and Hyrcanus had no real desire to fight. They were not fighters. They were scribes. They were lawyers, and they didn't really have the ability for war. So Hyrcanus retreats. He declares that he never wanted the throne. He surrenders his high priesthood and his and whatever throne he had to Aristobulus II. The two brothers vow eternal friendship. Their two children marry each other. Alexander and Alexandra marry each other. And that'll come into play later in Jewish history because they will have, of course, a daughter who becomes important to us in the New Testament. However, peace is short-lived, and Hyrcanus flees to Arabia. It's really interesting. And now we want to bring in Antipater. Antipas of the Edomites, was the father of Herod the Great. And Antipater is watching all this. So he's an Edomite. The Edomites are now sort of part of this Judea state. They are following the laws of the Jews. And Antipater is watching the civil war. And he's watching Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, sons of Alexandra, as they war against each other. And now he knows that Hyrcanus II has gone up to Arabia. He's fled. He's made this pact. He's not going to take this. So the Sadducees kind of have the Pharisees at bay in Jerusalem, and Antipater is watching all of this. So Antipater, the Edomite, sees this. He sees the position of Hyrcanus, and he sees it as an opportunity to fulfill his own dream of having some political power within Judea. And so he goes out to Arabia and he finds Hyrcanus, and Hyrcanus is out there with the king of the Arabs. It wasn't difficult for him to persuade Hyrcanus that he should go back and demand that he just be dealt with justly. He tells Hyrcanus that he has been dealt with unjustly and that he had been deprived of his inherited rights by his younger brother Aristobulus. And the Nabatean king goes with him, and he says, we'll help you out. And the Nabatean king, of course, was an Arab king, and they come in and they invade Palestine. They besiege Jerusalem. And Aristobulus shuts himself up in Jerusalem, prepares for this long siege. And all this time, now you've got Aristobulus kind of holed up in Jerusalem. The Nabatean king is in with, or is helping Hyrcanus, and Antipater of Edom, who is the father of Herod the Great, all watching as they surround Jerusalem. And guess who's watching all of this from way out in the east? Pompey, the ruler of Rome. And he's watching all of this, and he's kind of taking interest and notice in Jewish politics because the Arab king is now involved. And of course, he's out in the east, and he's watching what the interest there might be and why the Nabatean king might be interested in it. And all of this is focus now is being put on Jerusalem. And you've got the brother who's the Salome, Alexandra's two sons who have sided against each other, one with the Sadducees, one with the Pharisees. You've got this Edomite Antipater, whose son is going to be the first Herod the Great. It's really getting interesting, and they're all kind of focusing, and here come the Romans. In our next class, we're going to talk about the Romans. We're going to talk about Antipater, the father of who will become Herod the Great, and we're going to talk about how Rome becomes involved in all of this history. It's really interesting to think about. And so in our next class, we'll introduce Herod the Great.